Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Grazing Roundtable. We have an amazing panel here for us today, starting with Deanne Bowerly, Cody Rakes, if anyone was in here just now, Greg Hallich, and Brett Chadzoy. And they're going to talk with us about grazing and go a little deeper into the things you've heard from them earlier on. So I'm going to give everyone a chance to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about their background, where they come from, and what they're currently doing. And we're also going to use Slido today. So the tables have the QR code for Slido, and when Jenny comes back in, she'll explain a little more about how we operate that. There you go.
I'll stand up initially so you can see my smiling face, and then I'll probably sit. Brett Chadzoy. I am a regional extension forester with Cornell University. Our family has a 1,000-acre farm in Watkins Glen, New York area. That's half of that's pasture, and the other half is hay ground that we use to support a cow-calf operation. Currently, we have about 120 bred females on the farm. We overwinter the yearlings. That'll go off to their new homes as kind of like grass certified stockers. And we, over the past couple days, I've heard a number of speakers refer to themselves as oddballs. Probably all of us here see ourselves. We're at an organic farming conference, so we are a little different than some other farmers, and we certainly are the oddballs in our neighborhood as beef cattle farmers, because we do things that seem really weird to many of our other farmer neighbors. Like, we outwinter our cattle. We have 2 old dairy barns on the farm that are utterly worthless for putting livestock in the winter time. So cattle are out year round. They're bale grazing this time of the year. We push our grazing window as far as possible, which for the frozen north is about 8 months in an average year. We calve on pasture in May and June on green grass. Keep in mind we're about a month behind you in a normal year versus calving in mud like in March and April like most of our neighbors. And in the summertime, we like to keep our cows in shady silvopasture areas, and that was yesterday's session. So,
my name is Greg Hallich. I'm originally from very close to where Brett is in upstate New York, and that's how we know each other, and that's how he's down here. We recruited him down here to do his wonderful silvopasture talk. I'm an extension specialist with the University of Kentucky. Most of my work is kind of with cattle management. I'm an ag economist, but I look at practices that will improve profitability, such as bale grazing, improving the biological activity in your soils versus using commercial fertilizer. I also do a little bit of row crop work, mostly conventional. So, and on my farms, I grass finish. I have 2 farms in southern Woodford County. I grass finish cattle there. I bring in wean calves from 3 or 4 farms that I know well, so low stress situation, and I will have them generally for about 2 full years. Most of the cattle I finish now, I will take them somewhere between 31 and 33 months, and most of the time I'm hitting pretty much all choice now the last 4 or 5 years in terms of marbling.
Is there anyone in here that was not in here for the last session? Okay. I was just making sure I was in here for the last session. I didn't want to bore everybody with it all over again. My name is Cody Rakes. I am the farm manager at the Loretto Mother House Farm in Marion County here in Kentucky. If you've ever heard of Maker's Mark Distillery, we're just right down the road from Maker's Mark Distillery. And so on the farm, the farm is owned by a convent of Catholic nuns, the Sisters of Loretto. They've been on the land since 1824, so they've got a long history with the land, and they want to see the land have a history going forward as well. And so, caring for the land and conservation of the land and all the things that go with it are very important for our management. There's about 800 acres again, and there's about 250 acres in row crops, corn, soybeans, cereal grains, and cover crops. We do use those cover crops for some for hay production and also for grazing. And then on the grazing side, we've got about 60 cow-calf pairs, as well as about 25 to 30 yearling heifers from time throughout the year, different times that we're retaining for replacements. We sometimes sell some bred heifers and whatnot, but we also do some grass finished beef as well, or pasture-based beef finishing with some of those heifers. And do a lot of rotational grazing. We're working on implementing some native grasses and some silvopasture. We don't have the experience with that yet, but that's kind of our next leap. But we do some pretty intensive rotational grazing through the summertime with the grazing some warm season annuals. Where there'll be times where we actually move twice a day, move cattle twice a day. And you utilize stockpile fescue. And that's my professional grazing career. On my recreational grazing at home, my wife and I on our 65-acre farm, we have cattle, sheep, and goats. We also have some pastured chickens as well, but that's a pretty small component of the livestock on the farm. And so there we're using electric netting and doing rotational grazing with electric netting and those mixed species, diverse species. And I guess we can talk more about that later on.
Hi, I'm Deanne Bowerly. I'm from Gravel Switch, Kentucky, in Marion County, the same county as Cody, only at the opposite end of the county. I am an organic dairy farmer. We ship our milk to Organic Valley. We milk about 50 cows of all breeds, but primarily Jerseys. We're very heavy on Jerseys. We crossbreed with Holstein, Normandy, and Jersey. We also breed a few of the cows to beef, and we sell a little bit of freezer beef on the side. I run 3 different groups during the grazing season. We have the milking herd is one group, and they get moved after each milking, so they get a day paddock and a night paddock. And then during part of the grazing season, I will milk them, instead of twice a day milking, I milk them every 16 hours from like May 1st through September. And so that schedule is I milk at 4 a.m. and 8 p.m. on one day. And then on the next day, I milk at noon, and I only milk once that day. I do that because it gives me a little more time to work on management things and sleep and eat. And it does not cost me much. It doesn't seem in terms of production. I think the cows milk fairly close to the same amount, and it saves me a lot on electricity and the cleaning to clean the parlor and wash the pipeline and stuff. So it's a good fit for me in the summer months. I really enjoy it. I'd probably do that year round, but when the calves start coming in September, it gets difficult to feed the calves twice a day and milk the cows twice or once, and that schedule gets really screwed up, so then we go back to the twice a day milking through the winter months. And then the other 2 groups I graze, I'll have a group of my yearlings, heifers, they're yearling heifers and steers, and the dry cows. And then my 3rd group is the calves from the previous fall.
Thank you all very much. I wanted to start out asking about your grazing, obviously. But you, Cody, you mentioned that you have other animals at home and that you're doing rotational grazing. Is there any specific method that you use? I've heard people talk about running, this animal first, whether it be cattle first, and then the sheep behind it and tractors behind that. Or what's your method for what you're doing?
So up until this point, we haven't actually been mixing the animals together. We have run the animals over some of the same ground, but contrary to what a lot of people would tell you, we actually run our sheep and our goats together. And what we have found, and I think Angela, my wife, she would attest to this as well, is that there's kind of a balance on numbers proportionally. And so what we have found is that I mean, we haven't really put numbers to it, but probably somewhere around 2/3 to 3/4 of the animals are sheep, and then, 1/3 to 1/4 of the animals are goats. And with that proportion of animals, we get a really, really good utilization of the forage and the weeds and the browse and everything that is in those pastures. And from what I have seen, if we were to graze those animals first and move them a little quicker than we are currently, bringing the cows in behind of them would probably work really, really well, because the sheep and the goats have less preference for the grass. Obviously, that's what the cows are more interested in, is the grass. And so if we take the sheep and the goats into a paddock, we let them get their, what they're after primarily, and we don't make them eat some of the grass, they're going to leave that grass for the cows to come behind of them. The reason we haven't been running them together is on the front of the farm we've got fence that's suitable enough for cattle, and so we're able to maintain the cattle there. On the back of the farm, the fence is not suitable enough for cattle, and with the electric netting that we use, it's just too labor intensive to be moving it as frequently as we would need to in order to move those animals quickly enough so that we're not asking them to eat the grass. Basically, when I move those electric netting, I want the animals that require the electric netting to get as much of that forage as they can. I don't want to save any for the next group coming behind them. But going forward, that's probably how we will handle it, is have the sheep and goats in that paddock first, allow them to clear out the forbs, the browse, all the woody species, that kind of stuff, and then allow the cows to come in behind of them.
I think Jenny's going to explain some things to all of us.
Well, I probably don't have to explain it because you probably witnessed it earlier, but just wanted to mention that we are able to use Slido app for this session. So we do have the microphone. We're limited to just one microphone. So Slido does help us to not have to take the time to go back there and give it to you or to you to get all the questions into the microphone so that they're on the recording and clear for everybody to understand. So we can do that for anybody who needs to ask a question directly, but we also have Slido. So you can use that QR code. It's also on page 4 of your print program, and you can type in your questions and upvote other questions that you find interesting and would like the panelists to address. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jenny. I have one other question that I'd like to ask about how you finish your beef production or any other livestock that you're grazing. If you're grass finishing, grain finishing, or what do you do, and what's the difference between all of it, and what's included in that? I've heard that you could use alfalfa pellets and still call it grass finish. So could someone please explain? Okay. You want to go first?
For our steers, we just grass finish them on the pasture with their group that they're in. Our cows do get a little bit of grain. They're currently at 7.5 pounds of grain a day. The calves get a pound or two until they start grazing, and then they get no more grass or no more grain after that. And we just feed organic grain from coffee. It's just a grain mix. We don't use alfalfa pellets or anything like that.
So for ours, all of our beef we're direct marketing either to the kitchen that's there at the facility for the nursing home and the convent of the Sisters of Loretta, or we're direct marketing to consumers that are coming and buying either packages from us or shares from us, and so we don't have a private label that we're putting some kind of a claim or something on. So we're not certified grass-fed or anything like that, right? So, we're just honest with our consumers about how we're doing it, what we're doing. We do feed some grain from time to time. The past 3 weeks with this cold weather, you're darn right we've been feeding a little bit of grain. If we hadn't, we'd probably have frozen ears and frozen tails and declining weights and all those kind of things. So we remain flexible. Do we feed grain as a way to put extra pounds on? No, not as a general rule. But what I do try to do is as I mentioned, I'm developing heifers, And so basically when a heifer is born, her ultimate goal is she's either going to be a cow or she is going to be a steak. And I don't treat them any differently until it comes time for me to split them up at breeding time, not at breeding time, but at calving time. Okay, so when they get all the way to the phase of where they're going to be calving, they're 2.5 to 3 years old. All right, at that point they're either going to be producing a calf or they haven't bred, and they're going to go into the beef program, right? So I just try to make sure that I've got them on good forage. I try to make sure that, if I'm feeding hay, that they're in a group that's getting the better quality hay. We do produce, we'll usually put up a couple hundred rolls of baled haylage. So we take a winter annual mix of wheat, annual ryegrass, crimson clover, hairy vetch, Austrian winter peas, a good diverse mix of forage, and we'll cut that and bale it wet, put it in plastic wrap, and make sure that we've got some of that on hand. So if those animals need supplementation through the winter, we feed them that, and that usually is sufficient forage to keep them growing. And then just try to make sure that I'm always keeping them in mind that they need as good or the best that we've got available at any given time. But generally speaking, they're going to run with the cows.
Again, that's all I do is grass finish, basically. So that's kind of my passion, and everything that I do, kind of that I showed earlier, kind of fits into grass finishing, even though I didn't show you how I grass finish specifically. Pretty simple system. I get both spring-born calves and fall-born calves. So spring-born calves will end up finishing in January, and I'll tell you why that works so well here in a second. And then fall-born calves, and again, they'll be 31, 33 months old in general. Fall-born calves will finish in typically either late June or early to mid-July, and I don't like to go past mid-July just because it starts getting so hot and humid. So June, finishing in mid-July is like the easy, especially at that age, again, the 31, 30. You would be just absolutely amazed at how much weight and fat an animal that age on the best grass of the year, best pasture of the year, how well that they can gain at that time. So that's an easy one to do. The animals I finish in January are a little bit harder, but this is where I use, and Kentucky is a perfect place to do this. This is where I use fescue to my advantage. So I do not simply go through my pastures in the fall until they're done and then start feeding hay. I start feeding hay in a typical year probably in late September, early October, very little, but just enough to slow down the rotation so that I stockpile the bulk of my farm. This year was terrible in terms of the drought, right? So probably very few of us had good stockpile, but I still have stockpile now as soon as the snow melts, and most of it, I guess, has. But what I'm saying, at that time of year, we have fescue when it's at its best. Once we get the first hard frost, sugar content goes up. And if you have a lot of fescue, and you have, the other key is really good quality hay. If you have those two in combination, you're feeding them together, I think you will be amazed at what kind of gains you can get on those older steers or heifers in the fall and early winter. A lot of people don't think about this, but the one reason the combination works so good together is if I am pushing them on stockpile by itself, what is happening to performance as I try to get more grazing days out of that pasture? Performance is going down, right? Having that high quality hay in the pasture at the same time, they'll never go hungry. In fact, that hay is a signal to me that I'm doing what? If they start eating the hay very quickly, what is that signal? What are the cattle telling me? I'm pushing them too hard on that pasture. I need to move them quicker. So pretty simple system. And those that were here earlier, one farm, it's all perennials. The other farm that I showed you, the herbal lay, is kind of a combination perennials and then some annuals mixed in there. I can't recommend that system enough. I mean, both farms I'm doing pretty good, but with the herbal lay, I'm consistently, 31, 33 month animal, I'm consistently getting 900 to 950 pound carcasses on. The last batch I sent in July from that system, they averaged 933 pound carcass weights. Average live weight was 1630 or something. One was high choice, one was mid choice, and two were low choice. If you can consistently hit low choice on 100% grass, I feed no supplement, that's all that you will have to do to please your customers. If you can occasionally get a mid to high choice, your customers will love you, and you'll have some chefs that are beating down on your door for that meat.
We've spent the last almost 25 years trying to develop what we now call a grass-bred herd, both on our farm in farm in New York as well as our ranch in central Argentina. And I think we're still years away from having the ideal grass-bred animal, and I think that the genetics and breeding notice I didn't say breed, but breeding play a big part in that. The grazing management obviously plays an equally big part in that. So I've spent a long time thinking about how do you make the perfect grass-finished beef, and I don't think there's one recipe that works for all of us. I think many of us kind of zero in on things that seem to work well for our particular farms and situations. I mentioned earlier that we're a grass-certified herd or grass-fed certified herd. We used to be grass-fed certified through Animal Welfare Approved. We're not currently in that. And I don't have any philosophical opposition to feeding my ruminant animals grain. I just do it out of convenience. Work full-time jobs off the farm, my wife and I, so if we can not have to be there to throw grain in feed troughs, that just saves us valuable, precious time. One, I think, learning curve thing, though, I'd like to share with everybody here is that you can, and I tell my adult children this all the time, you can do a few things well or a lot of things so-so. And I think a lot of us as farmers make the mistake of trying to do too many things because it all sounds like a good idea. And we're a cow-calf herd. And first and foremost, we're focused on the performance of our cows and our calves. Our farm would actually be better suited for finishing animals. But we've learned the hard way not to try and mix too many things. We used to have a lot of sheep and goats. Sounds like a good idea, multi-species grazing, and then you realize you really have very different fencing needs and kind of nutritional needs and winter management needs up where we have real winters for those different animals. And honestly, for every different group I have on the farm, it may not, like going from one group to two groups to three groups may not double or triple the work, but it feels like that sometimes. So we have intentionally chosen to be cow-calf, and we think that we have the greatest chance of keeping it fun and profitable for us if we focus on just being really good cow-calf producers and not trying to be cow-calf producers plus finishers plus some other, we still do a bunch of other, pigs in particular, just because we like raising our own pork and I like knowing what I'm eating. But I think if we tried to do both grass finishing as kind of a mainstay of our farm plus the cow-calf operation, we're going to be either overfeeding one group or underfeeding the other. And that's what it boils down to why we aren't trying to do both, even though, retire someday and have the extra time, and then maybe we expand and do more of finishing or something else.
What grain supplement during this cold weather, what do you use for your grain supplement? Specifically, especially with dairy, are you supplementing with grain for your cows? And what do you use or prefer to use that keeps weight on them, or all the challenges that you might be having? But that goes for all of you with grain supplements. Are you using any?
So our cows get grain year round, and it's a grain mix we get custom made for us. It's right now it will change the protein depending on what they're eating, but right now they're just for forage they're getting baleage. It's Sudan grass, baleage, and or fescue, orchard grass, and a lot of clover in it. So we're running, our grain mix is about an 18 to 19% crude protein mix that we get. It's all mixed up. We just bring it in. The semi-truck brings it in, and we have a gravity bed wagon. We just put like 7 tons in there, and he comes once a month, and then we just open the bottom of it and get out 5-gallon buckets of grain and pour them out along the feed bunk for the cows. It's primarily corn, soybean meal, some roasted beans, a little bit of kelp and minerals.
For me, with just the cow calf, I often will just use whole shelled corn, not ground or cracked or anything, and just pour it straight out on the ground. I don't want to invest in the infrastructure of having grain troughs that feed troughs that then I've got to take wherever the cows are at. I don't typically creep feed our calves because, again, we're rotating, we're moving them around. It's hard enough to keep the mineral feeder going with them when you're moving them, 2 or 3 times a week. Hard enough to keep up with moving a mineral feeder with them, much less trying to drag a creep feeder along and drag a feed trough or 10 or 12 of them, however many you need for however many animals you got. And so we typically will only do any kind of supplementing in the wintertime when they're kind of locked down tight in one field and we're feeding hay diligently. So like, right now I'm feeding, we've got a little bit of mixed feed that we mixed ourselves. That's it's probably 80% corn. Again, we grow corn, so I've got corn on hand. 80% ground corn and 10% distiller's grain, 10% soy hull pellets. And I basically built that ration myself. Just tried to kind of balance the nutrients that I thought were needed based on, we've tested hay and know what the nutrient value is in the hay, and so trying to supplement the cows to meet the needs. And I mean, you've got all different needs because you've got gestating cows, you've got lactating cows, because I've got spring and fall calvers and they're all in the same group. We've got yearling heifers that are bred that are getting ready to calve for the first time. We've got some yearling heifers that have been weaned that haven't been bred yet. So we've got all these different classes of animals that we're trying to run together, try to minimize labor, minimize the number of water troughs we got to keep the ice busted on, all those kind of things. And so I'm just trying to kind of balance and as I think maybe somebody earlier said, trying to base it off of that highest value, which class of animals is it that you're really trying to focus on without trying to, limit the other ones, right? So, right now for me, it's those cows that are getting ready to produce calves. I want to make sure that they're maintaining body condition. Also, the cows that calved in the fall, make sure they've got ample feed supply to keep their milk up. And so if I can meet the needs of those two classes of animals, then I'm pretty confident that my heifers are going to grow fairly well on that same diet. So that's kind of where I'm at. Do I give the same mix to my sheep and goats? The sheep and goats, we actually supplement a lot less, but we have tried a couple different mixes in the past, and I think we are going to pretty much completely shift to just straight whole shelled corn is all we're going to feed to the sheep and goats. Again, same kind of scenario. We're moving them around, and so we're dumping it out on the ground because we don't have to try to keep up with feeding dragging troughs around. Now, ground feed is nice because you can have, you can mix it and have it whatever nutrient analysis you want it to be. But when you dump a powdered feed out on the ground, how much of it is actually getting in that animal? How many parasites are they picking up when they're trying to eat it? And so I think for us, we're just kind of evaluating it and deciding, well, if we're going to supplement, maybe we should just supplement with the whole shelled corn. They can pick it up. We're not going to have much waste. They're not going to be trying to dig in the ground to pick up all that little fine, loose dust, so they're going to probably pick up less parasites. And again, it's kind of a trade-off, trying to decide what's the most important. have I noticed if they eat too much corn, do they get loose stool or diarrhea? Oh yeah, you definitely can. But we're looking at, like with the sheep and goats, it's like half a pound per day per head is what we're supplementing. I mean, we're not doing that every day. So, you know, it's a really low, a low rate of feed that we're giving them. On the cows, I mean, we've got about 70 animal units in that field, and we're feeding like 4 or 5 buckets of grain every couple of days. So I mean, again, with those, we're not getting them fat off this grain. We're just keeping their body temperature up. It's probably more than like if we had a couple Skittles every day. It's probably like if we were eating a piece of pie, you know, for one meal a day. We're probably not going to get obese, but we're definitely not going to lose weight on it, right?
No, I'll just, so 2 things I'd like to say. One is I don't supplement, and I don't necessarily have anything against supplementing grain. All I would say is if you're considering doing it, you probably want to be very transparent with your customers, because I do know people over the years that have supplemented and they call that grass finished, which may be for some people, but I can tell you I know a lot of customers, if they found out that, quote, grass finished beef was supplemented with grain, they would be quite upset.
Greg, please raise your microphone.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry. So if you are supplementing, though, my understanding is, especially if you're finishing, that soil hulls are an excellent supplement because they will change the rumen composition, the acidity, much differently than grain traditionally does. And that is one complaint I've heard with any limited grain feeding is you're changing the rumen pH and the microflora in there. So you're kind of putting the accelerator and the brake on to a certain extent. You'll get better gains, but you will have a lot of inefficiencies in the forage that you're putting in the cattle. So my best understanding, and Brett may know more about this, but soil hulls are probably one of the better supplements to not change that rumen microflora. Even personally, if I had customers that were fine with a little supplementation, and I didn't think about it until Brett said it, but I wouldn't do it just simply because feeding a little bit of grain is almost as difficult management-wise as putting on full grain. You've got to have the grain out there. You've got to have troughs. You've got to have some mechanism to move stuff around, or you're bringing them up front, right, to some centralized location to do it. So, keep that. It's one thing to say I'm just going to give them a little bit of grain every day, but that is going to change your management to be able to do that.
I learned years ago from my grazing dairy friends not to say anything about dairy nutrition because I'm a beef person. I admittedly know little to nothing about dairy cattle and their nutritional needs. So I recognize that many of us in the room raise animals, dairy, beef, sheep, goats, whatever, where it absolutely may make sense to supplement animals with grain or other concentrates. I'm not one of those people, and therefore have very intentionally tried to breed efficiency into our beef cattle herds so that we do not need to rely on special supplementation. At the beginning, I said that we operate about 500 acres of hay ground. We don't do that because we're under any illusions of saving money by making our own hay. My life would be a whole lot simpler if I could just reliably buy 12 to 1,500 900-pound round bales every year and be done with it, of decent quality and reliable supply and price. The reality is I can't do that, and if I don't hay that land around us, it just gets plowed up and somebody grows something else on it. But besides just the peace of mind of having the supply, it's controlling the quality. We strive to produce the best hay possible because that can eliminate a lot of the needs to supplement with something that may be more costly. It's not always possible. We do we do a lot of first cutting and then opportunistically do some second and third cutting. And if we have groups that have higher nutritional needs, like this fall we have a group of fall calving heifers, It was an experiment, probably won't do it again, because even feeding them baleage and really good second cutting hay, I don't think we're keeping the body condition on them and meeting their nutritional needs. So the alternative then is things like protein tubs or concentrates. Just in general, I think many beef farmers do not do a good enough job of meeting the nutritional need of their cattle, and that's probably true of some other types of livestock farms as well. So I just don't want to be one of those farms, but I think that with the right animals and the right management and paying attention to what you're feeding them, we are what we eat. So feed your animals crap, their performance is going to be crap. If you feed them like you really love them and that you care about them staying happy and healthy and staying in good body condition to ride out extreme winter weather, then I think it's achievable without necessarily having to break the piggy bank to buy a lot of extra special groceries for them.
I just got one other thing to add. I'm not the economist that you two gentlemen are, but as a farmer, I get to wear a lot of hats, right? And one of those is being the economist for my farm. And I think that it's your all's jobs to be the economist for your farm. And it's important to think about and kind of look at the numbers. Angela and I, the past couple of years, we fed a lot of soy hull pellets because relative to corn, they were cheaper. Right now, in looking at the cost, and I mean, it's been a couple of weeks since I've done this, but feeding the corn was quite a bit cheaper, particularly the corn that I've got on hand, versus having to go to the store and buy soy hull pellets, versus what I could sell my corn for. So looking at that opportunity cost as well, and then also thinking about, like, for our operation, we're also producing grain, and so producing hay. When are you typically first cutting hay? Probably the same time I'm trying to I'm cutting my first cutting hay when I'm trying to get my corn and my soybeans planted and doing all that kind of field work. So, there's a lot of variables that you've got to take into consideration, and you've really got to evaluate what's your biggest fire? What fire do you really need to work on right now? And that's your highest priority. Thinking about what management task is going to give you the biggest payback at this point in time. Is kind of where you've got to evaluate and figure out how to make that decision.
Okay, and on that note, at what scale, like for acreage or herd size, do you find that grazing operations become profitable? Or can you answer that question? Or even a dairy operation?
I'd like to hear everybody's opinion on that, but we're all looking like deer in the headlights here. We'll let the economist, Greg, answer this one. I think grazing operations in general are very scalable. I think we can make them, I use the word profitability a little differently. If you were in my talk yesterday, you notice I basically referred to it as being worthwhile. So I think we all, it's not strictly dollars and cents for our family. It's like we see the land improving. We see, stuff that I always tell my wife, if we didn't have a whole fleet of expensive tractors, we could have a whole fleet of luxury cars or something like that. And that she'd rather see me have the fleet of tractors. So that's the beauty of grazing, though, is I think that whether you're really small or pretty big, you got to make sure that what you're investing in is in line with the scale that you're doing it at, because where we lose that potential for profitability is when we start having to invest in the heavy metal and things that can really start to, and depreciation is a real expense. It may not be something you're like pulling out of your pocket and handing to somebody else, but it's probably the biggest expense for many of us that have the big iron on our farms too. And so I just think that the way we can be profitable at a small scale is going to look differently than we can be profitable at larger scales.
So I've got an hour-long presentation for this subject, but obviously I'll give the abbreviated version. Let me just say this. So I have two 30-acre farms. How would you scale a 30-acre grain farm? What would you have on that? Pretty hard to do, in other words, with modern-day equipment, right? You can easily do it with a grazing operation with a caveat that you can easily go from having the capital that you should for a 30-acre or 20-acre, whatever, and very easily go from that unintentionally to having equipment that can do 200 or 300 acres and still have a 30-acre farm. And my point there is, once you get beyond where you should be, you're not going to be profitable. And that's very easy for folks to do, particularly if they're not doing it full-time, which you probably aren't if you have a small-scale farm. Now, I have better equipment than now, but I went over 10 years with nothing bigger than a 1950s Ford Workmaster. Does anyone know what that is? It's 34 PTO horsepower, something like that. I pulled a 7.5-foot Woods. It's not a finishing mower, but it has small bush hog blades. But the main thing I had to do with that is mow pastures. I do buy my hay, and this is an important consideration. If you're a small farm and you want to make your own hay and you want to be profitable, you better have either the cheapest, oldest equipment in the world, and you better be a really good mechanic, or you are not going to be profitable in that operation. Because once you've got nice hay equipment, you're going to have to do at least 100 acres or more of hay to justify that equipment, or you will not be profitable. That's a 5-minute presentation.
That's good, thank you.
What they said.
Okay. How do you avoid fescue toxins in your grazing routine? And have you considered switching to a different cultivar of fescue that is less toxic to livestock?
Greg sort of alluded this to you earlier. My 3 favorite things about fescue are December, January, and February. Those months of the year, fescue toxins are much lower. They are lower in the plant. Their concentrations are lower, and so that's one way to kind of work around that toxicity. I also strive for diversity in my pasture. I don't want a cow getting a mouthful of fescue, toxic fescue. I want her getting a mouthful of lots of different things. Fescue, orchard grass. In the summer months, Johnson grass, red clover, white clover, trefoil, lespedeza, a whole host of different species out there in that pasture helps to dilute the concentration of that toxin. Native grasses, warm season annuals, try to get those animals. I think the biggest, in my opinion, the worst time that you can have that impact, or when it is the most impactful, is in the heat of the summer and in the cold of the winter. When the cold of the winter, it's not quite as bad because that level of toxin is not as high in the grass. It is still high in hay. So if you're feeding toxic fescue hay in the wintertime, you're going to have those effects more than if you're feeding toxic fescue forage, green forage, because those toxin levels have went down. So those are a couple of things that I try to do. Dilution, try to graze it when it's most beneficial, and then find alternatives.
I would like to get rid of fescue, but I don't really know how to do it. We don't see signs of fescue toxicity like the fescue foot or any abortions or anything like that. I do see, like in the summer months, as the cows go to different pastures, I can check my bulk tank stick every day, and I can see that when they're in a pasture that has Sudan grass in it, that they milk much better than they do when they're on fescue. So I think getting rid of it would be a great thing. We have gotten it very thinned out in spots where we overwinter, and then you can reseed something else in there, clover or something like that.
I'm trying to think where to start here. So during the grazing season, the best thing that you can probably do is learn to get a good red clover stand into that fescue for a number of reasons. One, it's a legume, it's highly digestible, and you're diluting the fescue. And I meant to say this in my talk earlier, and I realized I didn't. But just in the last 5 years, there's been really good research on this done here in Kentucky by USDA ARS. And what they found is it's a riboflavin. I'm not a plant physiologist, but riboflavin. There's a component in the red clover that actually counteracts with so in fescue, the problem that it is causing by fescuosis, it's actually diluting the blood vessels. So they should be like this, and it's diluting, and what it does, it allows less blood flow through. That's why cattle love going into either ponds or mud wallows in the summertime, because that helps them dissipate the heat, which they should be doing if they were healthy. Red clover, that component actually does the reverse. It opens up those same blood vessels. So what they're finding is even a small, and I don't quote me on this, but even 20-30% red clover, and by the way, if you can have 20 to 30% red clover in the summer, and I promise you the cattle will eat a lot more than 20 to 30% in their diet. In other words, they're going to eat less of the fescue, eat more of the red clover. So number one is learn to get a good red clover stand in that fescue. Number two, and this will maybe be a pitch to bale grazing earlier. So again, I don't make my hay, I buy it, and I intentionally buy really good quality orchard grass red clover hay. And by the way, I did that before I realized about the benefits of the red clover. But what that does, as Cody said, I want to avoid, so basically by feeding hay early, by bale grazing, even at low densities, in the early to mid-fall, when the toxin levels are a little bit higher, what am I doing by feeding a little hay? I'm diluting that, right? I'm diluting the amount of fescue goes in. And what I didn't realize with that good red clover component, I'm actually dilating those blood vessels. So if you feed a little bit of non-fescue hay, particularly in the fall earlier, let your pasture stockpile, you will also get around the problem with the fescue at that time of year. For those that were here, having something like that herbal lay in the summertime that has no fescue in it, you've got those deep-rooted herbs, you've got the annual lespedeza, something like that is just amazing to have. Not that you're going to be on that 100% of the time, and I didn't explain this earlier, but my cattle are not on permanent pasture or that. They actually get a mix. In other words, they will have probably a strip of 2/3 of the acreage they have is in a permanent pasture, and then I give them a small strip of that herbal lay as what you would all call a supplement. In other words, that strip of that herbal lay is my supplement in the summertime. And here's the fescue expert from upstate New York.
Yeah, we're in the orchard grass belt, thank goodness. My understanding, though, of fescue toxicity is that the endophytes are concentrated in the seed heads, and just so I want to put it out there that finding a practical way of clipping seed heads may help reduce the exposure to the endophyte. We try to do the same with orchard grass, because if we can clip that seed head, the animals aren't going to refuse as much of the stalk on and orchard grass is a really, I have a love-hate relationship with it. I mean, it's just like one day it goes from being here and the next day it's like chest high. And if you can clip it at just the right time, you can almost like double the yield in the spring of how much orchard grass you can grow. But I haven't found an effective way yet to clip seed heads that are, say, 2.5 to 3 feet off the ground. The best we've come up with is to be able to clip things about 12 inches above the ground, which at that point you're clipping a lot of your forage that's available to the animal. But if you can find the right way to clip seed heads, that may help reduce the exposure to the endophyte.
Let me, and I completely forgot about this, and so I'm glad Brett mentioned this. But again, Brett is from up north, no toxic fescue. The only fescue that's planted up there would be for dairy farmers, but the end-of-fight free type variety. But again, I'm from upstate New York. Clipping is not nearly as important up in New York or northern Pennsylvania or Vermont or any of those compared to here in the fescue belt. And this is, I apologize for not talking about this earlier. So for two reasons, and I know a lot of people are against spending or burning diesel fuel to clip. But number one, just as Brett said, clipping those seed heads will get rid of a lot of those fescue problems. The other thing with fescue is it becomes a rank plant. So think about, you go through a couple of rotations in the spring, and I promise you, if cattle have not ate a fescue clump actually if they haven't touched it the first round, I promise you the second round, unless you're starving your cattle in May or June, they're not going to touch that fescue clump. So you have two choices. One is you don't clip, and you'll have a lot of fescue that stays there the rest of the summer, or you clip it, and you clip it low, and you get vegetative growth. If any of you noticed on hay fields, you will not typically see really rank-looking fescue. Go and look sometime. It's because they're cutting what? Really low. And I promise, it took me a while to figure this out, but the fescue that comes back when you clip it really low will be a lot leafier than the fescue I used to clip, like Brett's saying, as high as bush hog would go. That will work in New York, but if you want to keep fescue vegetative, you want to clip it early. You don't want to wait till August, but if you clip it from May 10th to middle of June, as low as you possibly can, you will end up with a pasture that the cattle will get a lot better utilization the rest of the summer.
Thank you. Can we talk about dung beetles? Have you noticed on your organic farms, like dung beetles and pads, and as your rotational grazing, helping with beneficial insects and with parasite loads?
Yeah, we have dung beetles, and my daughter's laughing because I have taken videos of dung beetles. So yeah, we have plenty.
I'm not an organic farm. We do use some fertilizers. We use pesticides. We use insecticides. We use dewormers. I mean, we use all those bad things. With we try to use as little of them as possible, right? But we don't use zero of any of them. But we do see a lot of dung beetles. It is very rare that I go, now during the growing season, it is very rare that I go into a pasture that animals were in, let's say 2 weeks prior to that I can find hardly any of a cow patty. They are gone. They have been sucked down into the soil. So very healthy dung beetle population. And then at home with the sheep and goats and those cows, if anybody has small ruminants, it's very, very common to use a lot of dewormers on those small ruminants. We've kind of tried to reduce the amount of dewormers that we're using. We don't do any broad spectrum across the board, treat everybody kind of dewormings. We only treat individual animals, and that's the same with the cattle, except for whenever we wean animals. When we wean animals, we will do everybody, but we're only doing all of those individuals that are being weaned. Their mothers are not getting treated, so we've got that refuge for those worms and also for the dung beetles. But yeah, we're using some of those products, but we're using them judiciously, and the rotational grazing and all the other soil health practices that we're doing. I think, in my opinion, but I think that overgrazing is probably more detrimental to dung beetle populations than a judicious utilization of some kind of a pharmaceutical product.
This would be in my extension duties for the university, but I get to see a lot of cattle farms all through Kentucky. And all I will say is the good news is the folks in this room right now are the ones that don't have to worry so much about not having dung beetles. But I can promise you on the majority of cattle farms in Kentucky, I'm not going to say they have no dung beetles, but they have very few because I'm with Cody. In fact, in my presentations, I try to show how important it is to get a good dung beetle population. And I tell them, come to my farm beginning of April, and any manure pat that you find, from the winter, put a little flag in it, come back a month and a half later, I'll give you $10 for every manure pat you find that you flag, because they're gone. In a healthy pasture ecosystem, they will be gone. But most farms in Kentucky are not like that. I've been on them. They will be there for months. And they all say, don't you drag your pastures? And the answer is, well, you may have to if your soil biology is dead or dysfunctional. But once you get that soil biology functioning, Mother Nature will take care of that for you, not just with the dung beetles, but with all sorts of biology.
Our farm is not certified organic, even though we probably easily could be, because to my knowledge, we're not doing anything that would exclude us from that. I just don't like paperwork. So I get to do plenty of paperwork during the day job, and I go to farm to not keep piling more paperwork on. So I feel like we've always kind of taken for granted our dung beetles and our brown manure flies and other beneficials that are out there. And I don't get out on as many beef farms as Greg does, because I'm an extension forester, not a grazing specialist, but I can tell almost instantly when I'm on farms that are using a lot of dewormers or fly control in their mineral mixes, because I call them the petrified patties, these like gray, dead looking things that seem to persist pretty much all season long. And I guess if we're probably doing things the way they should be done, the insects are going to be fine, but we can certainly do things that harm the insects too. And the reason we don't use dewormer is basically because I feel like if I have an animal that needs to be dewormed, the solution there is to just call that animal. The humane thing to do is to call that animal. Consequently, we don't have animals in our herd that I felt like I ever really needed to use dewormer. I'm not saying we've never used dewormer. I mean, if we have an animal that's in rough shape, we're going to throw the kitchen sink at to try and save that animal, but the animal will then eventually be in the freezer.
Let me just give one last thing. So I'm in a peer mentoring group it's mostly actually Tennessee. There's a few of us in Kentucky and down to Georgia. And about half at least are cow-calf predominantly. There's a few finishers, but we actually had this discussion in the last month about deworming. And all I can say is these are, to me, some of the top-notch cattle managers in the country that I know. And the consensus with the cow-calf side, again, I do not have cow-calf operation, is almost universally their strategy is they will worm their heifers, and sometimes their first and sometimes their second calf heifers. But if they have to worm a mature cow, like Brett says, it gets called. Maybe not. Maybe they'll probably worm it, right? But then once it straightens out, it's wormed. It's out of the gene pool. So long run, they're developing a herd that will be somewhat resistant to worms. And what they all say is mature cows just develop resistance, overall. So to me, that's a pretty good strategy. And then they do worm their calves. Most, not all, but most of them worm their calves.
We have found with our sheep and goats that, which I mean, we're still pretty inexperienced with sheep and goats. We've only had them for 2 years now. But what we have found is that if you're familiar with sheep and goats, you can do the FAMACHA scoring, which is looking at the color of their inner eyelid, and the more pale that coloring is, the higher their parasite load is supposed to be. And so, if their inner eyelid looks like a sheet of paper, you may not save that animal. If it's nice and bright and cherry red, then they probably don't have much of a parasite load, or they are not affected by whatever parasite load that they have. And so we use that along with some other physical cues to know whether or not those animals are being affected by their parasite load. And so we're treating individuals. But what we have found is that if we treat a ewe, we can go back and pretty much guarantee that her lambs are going to have to be treated as well. And so it is very much a genetic correlation in that parasite resistance. And I've listened to some podcasts that talk about how how parasite resistance works within an animal and how genetically those are very heritable traits. How that animal fights off that parasite load and is able to live with a parasite load and so on and so forth. So I would give a lot of credit to that. If you've got animals that are if you have an animal that needs a parasite treatment, make a note of that, and you probably follow that gene line, and you'll see that there's some correlation there.
How do you manage fertility and weeds in a rotational grazing system?
And weeds.
Yep.
You got the microphone. You can just go.
Yeah, I did a whole presentation on this. If they missed it.
Fertility and weeds. I think weeds are often a symptom of a fertility problem. So I know of no greater way to fix fertility issues. And when I say fertility, I'm really talking about the stuff that Cody and Greg have talked about, more holistically about what Cody and Greg have talked about during their presentations this morning, thinking about soil microbial activity and organic matter, and not just what a basic soil test tells you. Weeds, if you're that concerned about weeds, I would focus on what's causing those weeds. Weeds are, some people describe weeds as nature's scab, and that makes a lot of sense to me. But if I have, like up our way, you can see things like spotted knapweed. It's not all, it can be native plants like goldenrod. If, woody invasives encroaching into your pastures, that, to me, the solution is do better grazing and bale grazing, especially when you're buying in your hay, will probably amplify that considerably. I think we can, our number one reason for bale grazing is soil health. Like, there's nothing that improves the health and productivity of our pastures as much as bale grazing in the winter, especially if that hay is coming from someplace other than that pasture. And if you fix the fertility, and it may not be something you can fix overnight, but you could make steady progress towards, your weed issues are gonna probably be significantly less over time.
Let me just say, this is something we could talk about for hours, and we're not going to give a definitive answer about weed control. But I think what Brett was saying is, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but weeds are usually a symptom of either a fertility problem or a management problem. By the way, most fertility problems are management problems. Not always, but you might as well count if that's most likely what the cause is. There are going to be some exceptions, but and that's why this is going to take hours. To do this justice would be hours. So just very simplistically, that's how I would, generalize weed management. I will say one thing. Again, I'm big on clipping pastures, but clipping them at the right time. And in Kentucky, the right time for your first one is somewhere between early to probably mid 10th of May to middle June. I don't always get it done in that time period. A lot of times we'll go a little bit past that. But the main reason is, think about typically in early to mid-June, soil moisture levels are what? Are they good or are they poor at that time? They're still usually good. So if you get it clipped by that time, that pasture, even if you clip it low, will come back what? Very quickly. And if a pasture comes back very quickly, guess what? You're a step ahead of the weeds. If the pasture is coming up slow once you clip it, guess who's going to have the upper hand? The weeds.
Yeah, I'll say that most of the weeds that you're dealing with are very opportunistic, and if they're not given the opportunity to have sunlight and moisture and space, then they're not gonna be there. Now there's some exceptions to that. If you've got an existing stand of ironweed or multiflora rose or some of those kind of things that are perennial, that have canopy above the canopy of the forage, then obviously grazing is going to be a challenge. You're going to struggle to reduce their presence with grazing, and it may take clipping or herbicide treatment or manual removal or something to get rid of those. But if you're talking about buttercup, buttercup is one example that everybody's really going to start seeing here in about a month or so. In this part of the country, you're going to start seeing all these pastures start to turn yellow from all those buttercup flowers. Buttercup is so easy to control. It has to have space and sunlight. If you've got grass there, it cannot have space and sunlight. So again, I think that weeds, for a broad standpoint, are a symptom of some kind of failure in the grazing management, and fertility is very similar to that, I think. Moving those animals around. If you're not removing hay from that pasture, grazing animals remove very little. The production that you're producing, the animals you're taking off the farm, they are taking very little of the nutrients that they're consuming with them. Most of those nutrients are going right back out the back end of that animal. And so how are you making sure that those nutrients are being spread back out on that pasture where they need to be? And I think that's with the grazing management, making sure that you don't have loafing areas that are in one spot year round. Make sure you're kind of getting those loafing areas to move around. If you can move your water source, your nutrients are going to be drawn towards the watering source and towards the loafing areas, right? Because they're going to be grazing. They're going to come up. They're going to drink. They're going to defecate. They're going to go back out and graze some more. Same thing with the loafing area. They're going to go loaf. They're going to get up. They're going to defecate. They're going to urinate, and they're going to go out and graze some more. So that's where those nutrients are being drawn towards. So doing the management grazing, so you can keep those animals more dispersed on that property. Ideally, you walk out into that field when they're in a grazing system, in a grazing paddock. You don't want to be able to stand anywhere and not be able to, step on a cow patty, right? You want it to be spread out like a manure spreader has been out on that field. And that's how you keep your fertility spread out in those pastures.
Our dairy cows are housed in a hoop barn that we operate as a compost bedded pack. So we fill it with sawdust, and the cows add manure, and then we chisel plow it twice a day. As it starts to work, it'll produce heat, so when you chisel plow it, it steams, and it's all smoky in there. So those, I think that's the microbials doing their thing. And then in the summer months, we'll spread that back on the pastures and the hay fields. Also, anytime you purchase feed, you're bringing in fertility to your farm. So when your cows eat your purchased grain or your hay, and then they have the manure from that, you're adding fertility that way. As far as weeds, as we finish grazing a paddock, we'll make a decision. If it's weedy or it's got too many seed heads, we'll make a decision if it needs to be clipped or not to knock those back.
So as we were talking this through, I realized that some of us may be thinking of like these worst case scenarios where it's just totally overrun with something really noxious or a whole suite of noxious plants. First of all, not all weeds respond the same to the same treatment, so we have to recognize what our target species or two are and how you can kind of hit them where it counts. So some may be more vulnerable to clipping, some may be more vulnerable to improving your sward density, some may be they can't compete with better fertility. In other words, the same approach isn't going to work for all your weed problems. But I think whereas it's easier to deal with small problems before they become big problems, sometimes we're walking into a situation where it's a really big problem. It's just the site is overrun with something that's maybe stilt grass. Up our way, we have this horrible plant called swallowwort, which is it's like kind of the kudzu of the north and toxic to animals. You're going to have to roll up your sleeves and get really radical with that kind of stuff, because just going in there and like, oh, we'll graze the animals through there and clip it a little bit and do a little of this and a little of that, it's not going to be enough. So you have to be able to, I guess, assess what level of intervention is going to be necessary. For small weed problems, everything we've talked about, I think, can be a big part of the solution, but there's also going to be those situations where it's just like, it seems like it's a total lost cause, and I don't believe any land is lost cause. I think grazing can do amazing things to heal and rehabilitate landscapes, but you're going to have to really go at it with everything.
Just two quick additions. One is, and this is one nice thing about being on panel, because something Deanne said, it's easy to take your own knowledge for granted and assume people know things. So when Deanne said that they clip as soon as they're done with the pasture, that's exactly what I do, and that's really important. You don't necessarily have to do it like the next day or but if you wait for like a week or so to clip that pasture, the grass is regrowing, and then essentially you're regrazing again when you clip it. So, you don't want to do that if at all possible. So, if you're going to clip, be there right behind them. Try to get it done within a couple of days for sure. The other thing that I will just add on to, and those that saw my presentation will saw it visually, but if you're starting with a worn out farm that has a lot of weeds, that is not obviously your management, right? That was multiple people's potentially bad management over the years. So you're going to have a lot of weeds, and I'm assuming here in this crowd we're not going to be spraying, right? And as I pointed out in the presentation, even if you do spray, that's temporary. Those weeds will be back if the management doesn't change. But in the meantime, those weeds can be a valuable source for revitalizing that farm if you clip them. Because as we talked about, if you just leave them standing, they're going to, even if they die, if they're an annual, they will die, but they will oxidize. They're not going to fall down, and that won't be food for the biology, because they will slowly oxidize and fall apart. If they're perennial, they're going to, at the end of the fall, they're going to put their energy reserves and all their nutrients back down in the roots and come up the next year, right? But if you clip those, whether they're annual or perennial, number one, you get all the chemical fertility back to feed your good fescue, say in the fall or summertime. And better yet, when you clip those weeds, that if you do it correctly and if you do it at the right times, that can be food for that biology, to feed that biology.
Also can build somewhat of a thatch layer. And I think there's a benefit with you don't want to do this with every single rotation. Every time you graze a paddock, you don't want to trample and create a thick thatch layer. But having a little bit of a thatch layer of dead and decaying weeds and forage and manure and all those different components is a very, very valuable microclimate in an environment for dung beetles and earthworms and all those different arthropods and microbiology and all that stuff. It's a very I mean, scientists have probably spent millions of hours looking at all the different things that are going on in that kind of a climate. And so having that little bit of a thatch layer is really big for fertility and lots of other components of the pasture landscape.
Well, thank you very much. You have given us a lot of wealth of information to learn from here today, and it's already 4 o'clock. So I'd ask everyone in the room, if you would please, Jenny's passing out the green cards. Please contribute to what you've learned, what you would have liked to have learned, and how we can serve you better next time. But I really appreciate all you folks. You've done a fabulous job today. Thank you so much for your time.